Our next guest is going to tell us the amazing story of 6 million so-called citizen scientists doing important field work. iNaturalist is an American nonprofit social network of naturalists, citizen scientists, and biologists built on the concept of mapping and sharing observations of biodiversity across the globe. It's also a crowdsourced species identification system and an organism occurrence recording tool, whatever the hell that means. As of August 2025, iNaturalist had nearly 300 million observations in the books and millions of active users. Please welcome to our stage Scott Loari. He is the executive director of iNaturalist.org. Scott, welcome.
Everyone, my team built, for the first time, a real-time global system capable of tracking hundreds of thousands of species across the planet. But the amazing thing is, we did this just by getting millions of regular, everyday people outside, noticing nature, and sharing what they were seeing with us. Just getting outside, exploring, and experiencing nature. So I can trace my own passion for this back to growing up along the Russian River in rural Northern California. So I spent my childhood flipping over rocks, looking for frogs, catching turtles. And there are these fishermen that would come down to the river with these big, long fly fishing rods. And they'd talk about a time when the Russian River had one of the best steelhead runs in all of America. They'd talk about the river being lined by eagles. But by the time of my childhood, those steelhead were long gone. They were fishing out of habit. I never saw any of those fishermen pull the steelhead out of that river. The eagles were gone too. I hadn't seen any of those. I'd never seen a steelhead there. Even these little yellow-legged frogs that they say were so abundant that you had to be careful not to step on them, I couldn't find those either. They were completely gone. Why? Why had all these things disappeared? How big was this problem? Was this just a problem in the river, or was it a problem everywhere else? What was happening here? Could we bring these species back? When I went to college, I became obsessed with these kind of questions. And I learned that we are living through what scientists are calling the sixth great extinction, where we could be losing species about 1,000 times faster than the natural background rate. These are species that we depend on. But the evidence is sparse and patchy. So on Stanford campus, where I was a student, they have this biological field station called Jasper Ridge. And it's one of the best studied field stations in the world. And on places like Jasper Ridge, we do have hard evidence that kind of helps us understand what's going on. So what happened at Jasper Ridge? Well, we lost all the big mammals, most of the big mammals, but that happened a long time ago, and that's happened in many places. But they also have evidence of losing some of the smaller things more recently, some of the things that tend to go unnoticed. So like these reptiles and amphibians all disappeared from the preserve. Jasper Ridge has lost dozens and dozens of different plants, including all of these. And it even has some data on insects, which is the most diverse branch of the tree of life, but it's also where we know the least, including this is the bay checker spot butterfly, which was one of just a handful of well-studied insects in the world, and it disappeared from the preserve in 1998. So we had a pretty good idea of what was happening on reserves like Jasper Ridge, but what happens when we step off of reserves? Where there we know very little, maybe a smattering of museum data from here and there, but pretty much we're completely blind. So I set off on a career as a wildlife biologist, trying to fill some of these gaps by studying species around the world through the traditional way. So I used an electrofishing unit to study fish in streams. Down in the Caribbean, I studied lizards. In Panama and Costa Rica, I banded birds. And then in Africa, I put GPS collars on lions and elephants and buffalo. And all of this work was really important. We learned a ton about these species, but it's slow. And it all faces the same brutal constraint, which is just there are not enough scientists. There's not enough funding. There's not enough time to understand what we need to know about species using these means alone. And what's important about that is it means that we're protecting a planet that we couldn't even see. So here we are making billion-dollar decisions about your land and your water on records that are often 100 years out of date. It's like we're operating this conservation infrastructure with a blindfold on. And that is a really dangerous way to operate a changing planet. So around this time, I met a university student at Berkeley, UC Berkeley, named Kenichi Ueda. And he had just launched a social network called iNaturalist, a website. And it is a simple idea. You take wildlife photographers, post their photos, and then they talk to each other and identify each other's photographs through a social network. But when I saw that, I thought, these aren't just photographs. This is data. Every one of those photographs, it was a point on a map, and it had a timestamp. Right? So this is the same kind of data that scientists like me were flying around the world trying to collect. But here it was. It's right here, just generated by normal people. And I started thinking, why are we just sending hundreds of scientists out into the field when we could invite millions of everyday regular people to join us as the eyes and ears of the planet? So we set out to launch iNaturalist on a smartphone so that anybody, anywhere, can contribute to science and conservation. So this is how it works. You go out and you take a picture of any living thing, and first we have an AI that will identify it and tell you what it is, but then you post it, you share it. You share it with a global community of naturalists and scientists who will help tell you what it means, vet it, and turn it into scientific research quality data for science. So we've had millions of people do this now. We've generated hundreds of millions of records representing about 1 in 4 of all species on the planet. And this data has contributed to 7,000 scientific publications. In fact, most data in the world right now for most species is generated by people using this app. It's not from institutions, it's not from governments, it's just from people. But the surprising thing for me was that I was so focused on building a tool to detect species loss, but I also realized that we had built this tool for discovery. Right off the bat, we're seeing species turn up in all these amazing places that you wouldn't expect. So just to give you a sense for what I mean, these are just a handful of stories just from this last month. So how about this moth, this little green moth? So this was thought to be extinct. It hadn't been seen for 150 years, and it just turned up in South Africa. So species rediscovery, just from someone noticing this moth. This plant from Peru, turns out it's completely unknown to science. It's a completely new species, and scientists just gave it a name. And even here in Florida, this little crab, scientists have just published this paper using this data to show that it's moving up the coast, tracking warmer waters with climate change. And right now in New Zealand, the government is using this tool to invite people to track the spread of this invasive plant before it's too late. So iNaturalist has become critical global infrastructure for science and conservation. It's used by governments around the world to try to detect and eradicate invasive species before they cost billions. It's used by scientists to understand the impacts of climate change. And it's used by land managers to prioritize their protection. But remember where all this comes from. It's just a global community of regular, everyday people supported by volunteer experts, getting outside and noticing nature. Anybody can do this, right? It's not just collecting data too. We're actually changing the relationship that millions of people have with the natural world. And by leveraging technology, we punch far above our weight, right? We can serve this global community of millions with a staff of about 15 people. And by operating as a nonprofit, we can ensure that we're using this technology for impact and not for profit. And that means while most social networks, they're designed to optimize and maximize polarization and addiction and argumentation, we can optimize our social network for curiosity, for connection, for collaboration, for contribution. In fact, the New York Times called us the nicest place online, maybe. And the same goes for AI. With the wrong incentives, AI is disrupting, destabilizing communities. It's flooding the zone with noise and misinformation. But with the right incentives, AI is a really powerful tool. It can help us get collaboration on even greater scales to try to get even greater scientific impact in the pursuit of truth. Technology is a really powerful tool, but mission matters. So what's next? So what I'm really excited about is now that we're getting hundreds of millions of records coming in, we can start figuring out not just where species are, but where they aren't. And also not where species were, but where they are right now. And this, I think, is a game changer for conservation. For example, going back to that little frog from the river, so this is a map of 100 years of museum specimens. And if you looked at this, you'd say, well, okay, this frog lives pretty much everywhere in California. But most of these records are at least 50 to 100 years old. right? There's almost no recent museum collecting of this frog. So these data, they can't be used to tell you where the frog has disappeared. So let's contrast this with a map of recent iNaturalist data. So instead of, so now we can see clearly where this frog has disappeared, but also where it's still persisting. And this is important because it means instead of spreading our conservation resources thinly across large areas, we can pinpoint and target exact watersheds where we can have the most impact. You know, we're going from guesswork to aiming, right? And we can now do this for over 100,000 different species. We're really moving from a conservation system built on guesswork to a conservation system built on evidence. Another reason why this is a game changer is it's not so top down, right? It's bottom up. Because remember, this is all powered by individual communities that are spread out across the world. And these communities, they're not just monitoring data, but they're also protecting it and improving it. Like this iNaturalist user, he wanted to see more species in his yard. So he ripped out half of his lawn and started planting native plants. And in less than a year, he was able to bring back hundreds of species of birds, butterflies, and plants. I mean, imagine multiplying this by 1,000 or multiplying it by 1,000,000. Habitat restoration on big scales, it doesn't just happen by governments now. Anybody can participate in this. And also, I think that this bottom-up conservation is much more palatable to communities than top-down conservation. Like in the Russian River where I grew up, local farmers have been persuaded to just make small changes to some of their management practices, how they irrigate their vineyards, how they dispose of their pesticides, and the river is really coming back to life. These species are coming back. So that frog that disappeared from half the state that I mentioned, just in the last few years, I started finding them again in the river. Couldn't believe it. You know, this is this frog that I spent so much time as a kid trying to find, and now they're back. It's pretty amazing. And just last month, my brother, who still lives in this river, right? He sent me this photo. He caught a wild steelhead in the Russian River. This never happened when we were kids. Pretty cool. You know, for so long, flying blind meant that we had to choose between sort of hopeless inaction or uninformed action. But now, for the first time, we have a new path forward. We can see nature for the first time. We have a real understanding of where it persists and where it's slipping away. And we have a global connected community of people that care. We can draw a line from data to action and to results. So we have a choice. We can either sort of passively look the other way indifferently, or we can notice nature. And when we notice it slipping away, we can either be passive or we can participate. And this act of noticing, this simple act of going outside and noticing, learning the name of a butterfly or a plant or a bee, it changes you from a bystander, the first step to becoming a scientist or a steward. And when millions of us do this together, you know, we're not just having impact locally, we can have a global impact. But there's still so much work to be done for us to build this new kind of global movement for nature. And we need your help. So join us. An easy way to get involved, just go outside, take a picture of any living thing, post it to iNaturalist. If we work together, we can do this. We can solve this. Thank you guys so much.